On a February night in 1929, the most expensive home in California stood silent on a hilltop overlooking Beverly Hills. Inside its 55 rooms of hand-carved oak and imported marble, 5 children slept peacefully in their beds. Their mother, a society woman named Lucy, wandered the halls in her nightgown, wondering why her husband had been gone so long. Somewhere in the East Wing, in a guest bedroom that smelled of whiskey and cigarette smoke, 2 men who had known each other since they were teenagers sat in the darkness, talking about secrets that could destroy them both. Then came a gunshot. Lucy would later tell police she heard the sound around 11 that evening. But instead of rushing toward the noise, instead of calling the authorities, she did something strange. She telephoned the family doctor. And in the hours that followed, before the police finally arrived at 3 in the morning, something happened in that guest bedroom that has haunted investigators, historians, and visitors for nearly a century. By the time detectives walked through the mansion's grand entrance, 2 bodies lay on the floor of that guest room. One was Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr., known to everyone as Ned, the heir to one of the largest oil fortunes in American history. The other was his closest friend and personal secretary, Theodore Hugh Plunkett. Both had been shot through the head. The official story would call it a murder-suicide. The newspapers would move on within days. But the questions have never stopped. Who really pulled the trigger that night? What secrets were worth killing for? And why, nearly 100 years later, do visitors to this mansion still report seeing a man in old-fashioned clothing, staring out the windows, as if waiting for someone who will never arrive? To understand what happened inside Greystone Mansion on that February night, we must travel back decades earlier, to a time when the American West was still wild, and a young man with nothing but determination set out to find his fortune in the dust and danger of the frontier. Edward Lawrence Doheny was born on August 10, 1856, in the small town of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. His parents were Irish immigrants, his father a laborer who had fled the Great Famine in County Tipperary. Young Edward graduated high school as valedictorian at just 15 years old, a sign of the sharp mind that would one day make him one of the richest men in the world. But the classroom could not contain his restless spirit. Within 2 years of graduation, he had left Wisconsin behind forever. What followed was nearly 2 decades of wandering through the most dangerous corners of the American frontier. Doheny joined a surveying party in Kansas, where he helped subdivide Kiowa and Comanche reservation lands. He prospected for gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, only to be driven out by federal soldiers protecting Indian territory. He drifted through the silver mining camps of Arizona and New Mexico, where he fought Apache raiders, survived a mountain lion attack that mangled his hand, and once fell down a mine shaft so badly that both his legs were broken. During those long months of recovery, Doheny taught himself law and was admitted to the bar in the territory of New Mexico. But the law could not hold him either. The call of fortune was too strong. He kept searching, kept digging, kept dreaming of the strike that would change everything. Years passed. His first wife grew ill from the harsh frontier conditions. Their daughter died young. Doheny himself was approaching 40, with little to show for 2 decades of backbreaking work. And then, in 1892, everything changed. By this time, Doheny had drifted to Los Angeles, then a sleepy seaside town of orange groves and Spanish missions, nothing like the metropolis it would become. One day, he noticed something peculiar. A man was driving a cart through downtown, and the wheels of that cart were coated with a thick black substance. Doheny stopped the man and asked where the tar had come from. The driver pointed northeast, toward an area near what is now Dodger Stadium, where bubbling tar pits had been used for fuel at a nearby ice plant. Other men might have seen nothing more than a messy road hazard. Doheny saw the future. He contacted an old prospecting partner from his New Mexico days, Charles Canfield, and together they leased a lot near the tar seeps. They had almost no money for proper equipment, so they improvised. Using a 60-foot eucalyptus tree trunk that they had sharpened to a point, Doheny and Canfield began digging by hand. Day after day, they bored deeper into the earth, the smell of petroleum growing stronger with every foot. At a depth of about 160 feet, they struck oil. It was November 4th, 1892. The well produced only about 45 barrels a day at first, a modest beginning by later standards. But Doheny understood immediately what others would take years to realize. Oil was the future. Steamships would run on it. Locomotives would burn it. The entire industrial world would soon depend on this black gold bubbling beneath the California soil. Within 2 years, there were 80 wells pumping in the Los Angeles area. Within a decade, Doheny owned or controlled most of them. He had become the largest oil producer in Southern California, and he was just getting started. While other tycoons were content to dominate a single region, Doheny set his sights on an even greater prize: the vast, unexplored oil fields of Mexico. In 1901, he drilled the first successful oil well in Mexico's Tampico region. What followed was a bonanza beyond even Doheny's wildest dreams. The Mexican oil fields were so rich, the crude so high quality, that gushers routinely shot 100 feet into the air. By the 1920s, Doheny's Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company had become one of the largest oil companies in the world, with operations spanning California, Mexico, and Venezuela. His personal fortune was estimated at over $100 million, equivalent to several billion today. But even as Doheny accumulated wealth that would make kings envious, tragedy stalked his family like a shadow. His first wife, Carrie, had descended into mental illness during their frontier years. After their divorce, she swallowed battery acid and killed herself. His only daughter from that marriage had died of rheumatic fever at just 7 years old. When Doheny remarried in 1899 to a woman named Estelle, he poured all his hopes and love into their only child, a son born in 1893. They named him Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr. Everyone called him Ned. From the moment of his birth, Ned Doheny lived a life of extraordinary privilege. He grew up in Chester Place, a gated community of Victorian mansions that his father would eventually own entirely. He attended the finest private Catholic schools. He studied at Stanford and USC. By all accounts, he was a charming, handsome, athletic young man with an easygoing personality and what friends described as a heart of gold. Yet beneath the surface, Ned carried wounds that wealth could never heal. He had been only 7 when his parents divorced, and his birth mother took her own life. His new stepmother, Estelle, raised him with devotion, but the scars of early trauma never fully faded. Ned idolized his father, but the elder Doheny was often absent, building his empire in the jungles of Mexico or the boardrooms of New York. Once, as a small boy, Ned said something to his mother that revealed the loneliness hidden behind his privileged life. "Mama," he said, "we could be awfully happy if we were poor, couldn't we?" When she asked him why, the boy replied simply, "Because Papa wouldn't go away so often." In 1913, while courting a young woman named Lucy Smith, the daughter of a prominent Pasadena Railroad executive, Ned met someone who would become the most important person in his life outside his family. Theodore Hugh Plunkett worked as a mechanic at a gas station owned by Lucy's father. He was from a working-class family in Illinois, without wealth or social connections, but he and Ned connected instantly. Despite coming from completely different worlds, the two young men formed a bond that would last until death, though neither could have imagined how that death would come. Ned married Lucy on June 10, 1914, in a lavish ceremony that drew society guests from across the country. Hugh Plunkett was there, watching from the crowd as his friend began a new chapter of his life. Soon after, Ned hired Hugh as his driver and personal assistant. It was a natural arrangement, a way for Ned to keep his closest friend by his side while providing him with steady employment. When America entered the Great War in 1917, both men enlisted together. Ned became a lieutenant in the Navy. Hugh served as a machinist's mate on a submarine chaser. They saw action in European waters, shared the terror and camaraderie of combat, and emerged from the war with a bond even stronger than before. When they returned home, Hugh became Ned's confidential secretary, a position that made him privy to the most sensitive details of the Doheny family's business and personal affairs. The arrangement worked beautifully for years. Ned and Lucy had 5 children, filling their home with laughter and chaos. Hugh married as well, though his union would prove far less happy. Through it all, the two friends remained inseparable. Hugh traveled with Ned on business trips. He handled correspondence and finances. He was trusted so completely that he often signed checks in Ned's name for hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the Doheny's youngest son was born, they christened him Timothy Hugh Doheny, in honor of the friend who had become like family. But in 1921, a simple errand would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy them both. In the early years of the Harding administration, the federal government controlled vast naval oil reserves in California and Wyoming. These reserves had been set aside to ensure the Navy would have fuel in wartime, but powerful oil men had long coveted access to that petroleum. In 1921, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, a friend of Edward Doheny Sr. from their prospecting days in New Mexico, arranged to have control of these reserves transferred from the Navy to his department. What happened next became one of the greatest scandals in American political history. In November of 1921, Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett arrived at Albert Fall's hotel room in Washington carrying a black bag. Inside that bag was $100,000 in cash, about $1.8 million in today's money. Fall later claimed the money was a personal loan from his old friend. Federal investigators saw it as what it really was: a bribe. In exchange for that black bag of cash, Fall granted Edward Doheny Sr.'s company exclusive leasing rights to the Elk Hills Naval Oil Reserve in California, one of the largest petroleum deposits in the country. A similar deal was struck with another oil tycoon, Harry Sinclair, for the Teapot Dome Reserve in Wyoming. Together, the leases were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At first, the arrangements went unnoticed, but in 1922, Wyoming oil men spotted trucks from Sinclair's company hauling equipment onto federal land. The Wall Street Journal broke the story. A Senate investigation began. What emerged over the following years was a picture of corruption so vast, so brazen, that it stunned the nation. Albert Fall became the first cabinet member in American history to be convicted of a crime committed in office. He was sentenced to a year in prison and fined $100,000, the same amount he had accepted in that black bag. The leases were invalidated by the Supreme Court and returned to the Navy. The Teapot Dome scandal became synonymous with government corruption, a benchmark of dishonesty that would not be surpassed until Watergate half a century later. For the Doheneys, the scandal became an existential threat. Edward Doheny Sr. faced criminal charges for bribery. Ned, as the man who had physically carried the money, was also implicated. And Hugh Plunkett, who had accompanied Ned to Fall's hotel room and watched as the cash changed hands, lived in terror that he too would be indicted. It was during this period of legal peril and mounting anxiety that Edward Doheny Sr. decided to build the greatest gift any father had ever given a son. The land had been in the Doheny family since the 1910s, when the elder Doheny purchased a 400-acre ranch on a hillside overlooking Beverly Hills. The views were spectacular, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Los Angeles basin, where oil derricks still pumped the crude that had made the family rich. But the property remained undeveloped for over a decade, waiting for the right moment. In 1926, Doheny hired Gordon Kaufman, one of the most celebrated architects in California. Kaufman had made his name with Mediterranean revival mansions for wealthy clients, but for the Doheny estate, he would design something completely different. A Tudor revival palace that would look as if it had been transported from the English countryside. The style was an unusual choice for sunny California, but it reflected the Dohenys' aspirations. They didn't just want to be rich, they wanted to be royalty. Construction began on February 15, 1927, and would continue for nearly 3 years. The mansion was built of steel-reinforced concrete, faced with gray Indiana limestone that gave the structure its name, Greystone. The roof was covered in Welsh slate, 3 to 4 inches thick, imported from across the Atlantic. The floors of the grand hall were inlaid with black and white marble in intricate geometric patterns. Every oak banister, balustrade, and rafter was hand-carved by master craftsmen. Each of the 7 chimneys was designed by a different artist, ensuring that no two were alike. The leaded glass windows were custom-made. The copper drainage gutters were solid lead. Nothing was too expensive, too elaborate, too perfect for the home that would house the Doheny heir and his growing family. The final cost was $3,166,578.12. The mansion alone accounted for over $1 million of that sum. In 1928, it was the most expensive private residence ever built in California. Adjusted for inflation, it would cost well over $50 million today. The grounds were equally impressive. Paul Tien, a German-American landscape architect who had worked under Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., designed the gardens on 3 formal terraces, blending Italian and English influences. Stone staircases led to reflective pools. An 80-foot cascading waterfall tumbled down the hillside. There were 2 ornamental lakes, a greenhouse, tennis courts, stables, kennels, a fire station, and a gatehouse. Babbling brooks wound through the property, feeding into the pools and waterfalls that gave the estate an almost otherworldly beauty. But throughout the construction, something was wrong with Hugh Plunkett. While Ned spent much of his time in Washington supporting his father through the endless Teapot Dome legal proceedings, Hugh remained in California to oversee the building of Greystone. It was an enormous responsibility. He signed checks, supervised contractors, and made countless decisions about materials and finishes. The work consumed him, and so did the fear. Hugh understood what the investigators in Washington might do if they decided to make an example of him. He was not protected by wealth or political connections. He had no army of lawyers to shield him. If someone had to take the fall for that black bag of cash, it would likely be him. As the months passed, Hugh's mental state began to deteriorate. His marriage collapsed. He divorced his wife in 1928. His sleep became erratic. His hands trembled. Friends noticed that he seemed distracted, anxious, nothing like the steady, reliable man they had known for years. In the autumn of 1928, with the mansion finally ready for occupancy, Ned, Lucy, and their 5 children moved into Greystone. It should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of years of planning and millions of dollars in investment. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. That Christmas Eve, the Dohenyes hosted a lavish party at their new home. The cream of Los Angeles society gathered in the grand hall, admiring the hand-carved woodwork and the imported chandeliers. Champagne flowed despite prohibition. An orchestra played in the balcony above the living room. And somewhere in the midst of all that glittering celebration, Hugh Plunkett suffered a complete nervous breakdown. The details of what happened that night have never been fully revealed. What is known is that Hugh's behavior became so alarming that the Dohenyes insisted he rest at Greystone to recover. The family doctor, Ernest Clyde Fishbaugh, was called in to monitor his condition. For weeks, Hugh stayed at the mansion, a guest in the palace he had helped build, a prisoner of his own unraveling mind. By February of 1929, the situation had reached a crisis point. Hugh had moved out of Greystone to his own apartment in Hollywood, but his mental state had not improved. The Doheny family decided that more drastic intervention was needed. On the afternoon of February 16th, Ned, Lucy, and Dr. Fishbaugh visited Hugh at his apartment. They urged him to check himself into a sanitarium, a psychiatric facility where he could receive treatment away from the pressures of the outside world. Some historians have suggested that the sanitarium was intended not just to help Hugh's mental health, but to keep him from testifying in the ongoing Teapot Dome proceedings. If Hugh were institutionalized, he could be deemed unfit to take the stand. The Doheny family's secrets would remain safe. Whatever the true motivation, Hugh refused. According to Dr. Fishbaugh, he simply sat there, hands clenched, jaw set, almost shaking at times. He said he would come out of it all right. The doctor left, convinced that further pressure was useless. That evening, around 9:30, Hugh drove to Greystone. The gatekeeper recognized him immediately and let him through. After all, Hugh had spent years coming and going from this property. He had his own key to the mansion. There was nothing unusual about his arrival. What happened inside the house over the next few hours remains one of the great mysteries of Los Angeles history. According to the official account, Hugh used the mansion's internal telephone switchboard to call Ned, who was in another part of the house, and asked if they could talk. Ned agreed and met Hugh in a guest bedroom in the East Wing, on the ground floor. The two men talked, drank, and smoked cigarettes while Lucy remained upstairs with the children. The conversation grew heated. Ned, according to some accounts, made impulsive remarks that upset his friend. The exact nature of those remarks has never been disclosed. But whatever was said, the tension in that room escalated beyond the point of no return. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, Lucy Doheny heard what she described as a loud noise, possibly a gunshot, possibly furniture being overturned, but she did not investigate. She did not call the police. Instead, she telephoned Dr. Fishbaugh and asked him to come to Greystone immediately. Why would a wife, hearing a potential gunshot in her home, call a doctor instead of the authorities? This question has haunted investigators for generations. Lucy's defenders suggest she knew Hugh was unstable and assumed any disturbance involved his mental state rather than violence. Her critics suspect she already knew something terrible had happened and was buying time to manage the situation before the authorities arrived. Dr. Fishbaugh arrived at Greystone sometime around 11:30. He and Lucy approached the guest bedroom together. What they found outside that door was Hugh Plunkett, alive but visibly distressed, holding a gun. According to Fishbaugh's later testimony, Hugh warned them not to come any closer. Then he retreated into the bedroom, shut the door behind him, and fired a second shot. When Lucy and the doctor finally entered the room, they found two bodies. Ned Doheny lay on his back, wearing only his underwear and a silk bathrobe. A bullet had entered the back of his skull. Hugh Plunkett was sprawled face down a few feet away, a pool of blood spreading beneath his face. An unfinished cigarette was still trapped beneath his fingers, the heat of its ember burning into his skin. The murder weapon, a Bisley .45 caliber Colt revolver that belonged to Ned, lay underneath Hugh's body. The police were not called until sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, more than 3 hours after the first shot was heard. When they finally arrived, they found a crime scene that had been thoroughly disturbed. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that the bodies had been moved before investigators entered the room. The family had summoned Edward Doheny Sr., who had rushed to Greystone in the middle of the night and had to be carried from the guest bedroom, sobbing uncontrollably after seeing his only son's corpse. Within 48 hours, District Attorney Buren Fitz declared the case closed. There would be no inquest. The official ruling was murder-suicide. Hugh Plunkett, driven mad by his deteriorating mental state and personal problems, had shot Ned Doheny and then turned the gun on himself. The motive, authorities claimed, was either Hugh's nervous disorder or anger over not receiving a raise. But almost immediately, investigators noted problems with this tidy explanation. Powder burns were found around the wound on Ned's head, indicating he had been shot at close range. But Hugh's wound showed no such burns, suggesting his shot had come from further away, an unusual finding for a self-inflicted wound. The cigarette burning Hugh's fingers implied he had been smoking when shot, hardly the posture of a man about to kill himself. The gun had no fingerprints on it whatsoever, as if it had been wiped clean. Detective Leslie White, who investigated the scene, later wrote in his autobiography that he believed the case had been covered up. He noted that the bodies had been moved, the evidence had been compromised, and the Doheny family's immense wealth and influence had ensured that no serious investigation would ever take place. Perhaps the most telling evidence came from the burials themselves. Ned Doheny was not interred in the family plot at Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic burial ground where the devout Doheny family would normally have laid their dead to rest. Instead, he was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, a secular cemetery. In the Catholic Church of that era, suicide was considered a mortal sin, and those who took their own lives could not be buried in consecrated ground. The implication was clear. The Doheny family believed, or at least suspected, that Ned had not been murdered. Perhaps he had killed Hugh and then himself. Perhaps something else had happened that night, something so shameful that even in death, Ned could not be welcomed into the Catholic embrace. Hugh Plunkett was buried at Forest Lawn as well, just 100 feet from his friend. Lucy Doheny sent an enormous floral arrangement to his funeral. 2 of her brothers served as pallbearers. Whatever had happened between the two men, the families remained intertwined even in death. In the years that followed, dozens of theories emerged to explain the tragedy at Greystone. Some believed that Hugh really had killed Ned in a fit of madness, driven beyond endurance by the pressures of the Teapot Dome scandal and his failing marriage. This remains the official explanation, and is probably the simplest one. Others suggested that Ned had killed Hugh to prevent him from testifying about the black bag of cash, then taken his own life out of guilt. This theory explained the burial at Forest Lawn and the unusual forensic evidence, but it conflicted with accounts of Ned's gentle, easygoing personality. Still others whispered that the two men had been more than friends. In the rigid social world of 1920s America, a romantic relationship between two men would have been utterly scandalous, especially for the heir to an oil fortune with 5 children and a society wife. If Lucy had discovered such an affair, she might have killed them both in a jealous rage. This theory explained why she had delayed calling the police and why the bodies had been moved, but no solid evidence has ever emerged to support it. A more sinister theory suggested that both men were killed by a third party, perhaps a hitman hired by someone who wanted to silence them before they could testify about the Teapot Dome bribes. Edward Doheny Sr. had powerful enemies. A dead witness could tell no tales. The truth, whatever it may be, was buried with the two bodies at Forest Lawn. The Doheny family never spoke publicly about what happened that night. Lucy remarried within a year and continued living at Greystone with her new husband, Lee Batson, for another 26 years. She died in 1993 at the age of 100, taking her secrets with her. Edward Doheny Sr. never recovered from his son's death. He was acquitted of the bribery charges in a trial that many considered a miscarriage of justice, given that Albert Fall had been convicted of accepting the same bribe that Doheny was found not guilty of paying. But the verdict brought him no peace. His health declined rapidly. He became reclusive, rarely leaving his Chester Place mansion. On September 8, 1935, Edward Lawrence Doheny died at the age of 79. His estate was valued at around $15 million, a fraction of what it had been at its peak. The scandals, the legal battles, and the death of his only son had taken a terrible toll. His widow, Estelle, buried his personal papers and devoted the rest of her life to Catholic philanthropy, as if trying to atone for sins that were never fully confessed. The Doheny name lives on in Los Angeles. There is a Doheny Road, running along the edge of Beverly Hills past the gates of Greystone. There is Doheny State Beach in Dana Point, donated to California as a memorial to Ned. There is the Edward L. Doheny Jr. Memorial Library at the University of Southern California, built with a $1.1 million donation from the grief-stricken father. When the library opened in 1932, California Governor James Rolfe Jr. declared, "Here we see perpetuated the love of a father for his dutiful son." But the greatest memorial of all remains Greystone Mansion itself. After Lucy moved out in 1955, she sold most of the original land to developers who built the prestigious Trousdale Estates neighborhood on the hillside. The mansion and its remaining 18 acres were purchased by a Chicago industrialist named Henry Crown, who owned the Empire State Building. But Crown never lived at Greystone. His wife, upon learning of the home's bloody history, refused to set foot in the house. Instead, Crown rented the property to film studios, beginning Greystone's second life as one of Hollywood's most popular shooting locations. In 1965, the city of Beverly Hills purchased Greystone for approximately $1.3 million. The city's original plan was simply to use the hilltop site for a water reservoir, as its elevation provided excellent natural pressure for the municipal water system. But a citizens' committee formed to save the mansion from demolition, and in 1971, Greystone was opened as a public park. Today, visitors can walk the same grounds where the Doheny children once played, admiring the same views that Ned saw from his bedroom window in the months before his death. The formal gardens have been restored, their geometric hedges and reflective pools maintained by city staff. The cascading waterfall still tumbles down the hillside. The mansion's exterior looks much as it did in 1928, its gray limestone walls gleaming in the California sun. But the interior of Greystone is another matter. The house is generally closed to the public, opened only for special events, filming, and occasional ranger-led tours. Those who have ventured inside report an atmosphere that is difficult to describe. The grand halls feel empty in a way that goes beyond mere vacancy. The hand-carved woodwork, so lovingly crafted by master artisans, seems to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Shadows linger in corners even on bright days. And then there are the ghosts. Over the decades, hundreds of people have reported paranormal experiences at Greystone. Park rangers have quit their jobs rather than work another night shift at the mansion. Film crews have captured unexplained sounds on their equipment. Visitors have smelled rotting flesh in the bedroom where the bodies were found, long after all traces of the crime should have faded. A park ranger witnessed faucets turning on by themselves in the mansion's bathrooms. A photographer felt an icy presence brush past her in the hallway. Two tourists once approached a staff member and asked how to join the mansion tour, explaining that they had seen a man in period clothing staring out one of the upper windows. When told that the interior was closed and no such tour existed, they insisted they had seen someone. Perhaps, the staff member suggested, it was the ghost of Ned or Hugh, still waiting for visitors who would never arrive. One investigator who spent years collecting accounts of paranormal activity at Greystone documented over 237 separate incidents. He interviewed park employees, police officers, janitorial staff, and film crew members, all of whom described experiences they could not explain. Apparitions walking the halls, voices speaking in empty rooms, the sound of gunshots echoing through the night, 90 years after the last shot was fired. During the filming of National Treasure: Book of Secrets in 2007, a sound technician decided to leave his equipment running overnight to see if anything unusual would be captured. The next morning, the tape contained a loud bang, like a gunshot, followed by the sound of something heavy falling and then being dragged across the floor. When the crew returned to investigate, they found no evidence of any disturbance. The alarm system showed no intrusions. The set was exactly as they had left it. Whether these phenomena are genuine supernatural occurrences or the product of overactive imaginations primed by Greystone's tragic history is impossible to say. What is certain is that the mansion carries an atmosphere of unfinished business, of questions that were never answered, and justice that was never served. Every year, for more than 2 decades, a play called The Manor has been performed at Greystone. Written by Catherine Bates and directed by Beverly Olivan, the production takes place in various rooms throughout the mansion, with audience members separated and watching different scenes in different orders. The plot is a fictionalized account of the Doheny family, including the Teapot Dome scandal and the mysterious deaths. It is Los Angeles' longest-running play, a testament to the enduring fascination with what happened inside these walls. The mansion has appeared in dozens of films and television shows over the years. Its grand staircase, one of the most photographed architectural features in Hollywood, has been seen in The Big Lebowski, Ghostbusters 2, The Bodyguard, The Witches of Eastwick, and countless others. The house served as the exterior of Wayne Manor in Batman and Robin. Its bowling alley was renovated for There Will Be Blood, the 2007 film loosely inspired by Edward Doheny Sr.'s rise to power. Perhaps it is fitting that Greystone has become a place of illusions, a stage where actors pretend to live lives as dramatic as those that actually unfolded here. The mansion has always been more than a building. It has been a symbol, first of wealth and power, then of scandal and tragedy. now of mystery and memory. Standing on the terrace today, looking out over the same view that Ned Doheny saw on that last February evening, one can almost understand why Lucy stayed. Despite everything that happened in that guest bedroom, she continued to live at Greystone for another 26 years. She raised her 5 children within these walls. She remarried and entertained guests and grew old surrounded by the opulence that her first husband's money had bought. Was she haunted by what she had witnessed? Did she hear footsteps in the night, echoing from the east wing where 2 men had died? Or had she made her peace with the past, accepting that some questions would never be answered and some wounds would never heal? At the end of her long life, Lucy's grandchildren would sometimes visit her. They remembered an elderly woman who would wake each morning, dress as if for a luncheon engagement, and sit in a wingback chair in her living room with her purse on her lap. And wait. When they asked what she was waiting for, she never answered. Perhaps she didn't know herself. Perhaps she was waiting for her husband to come home, as she had waited that night so many years ago. Perhaps she was waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions, to unlock the truth that she had carried alone for more than half a century. She died without ever speaking publicly about what happened on February 16th, 1929. The secrets she knew went with her to the grave. And high above Beverly Hills, the mansion she left behind still stands. Its gray walls catch the California sunlight, as beautiful and as mysterious as the day it was completed. The fountains still splash. The gardens still bloom. Visitors still wander the grounds, taking photographs and wondering what it must have been like to live in such splendor. But as the afternoon shadows lengthen and the tourists begin to leave, there comes a moment when Greystone seems to belong to another time entirely. The modern city fades away. The sounds of traffic grow distant. And for just an instant, one can almost imagine 2 young men walking together across the terrace, talking and laughing as they had done for so many years, before scandal and madness and death tore them apart. They are still here, some say. Ned and Hugh, bound together in death as they were in life, unable to leave the house where their story ended so violently. They wander the halls at night, searching for answers that will never come. They stare out the windows, watching for the arrival of guests who died generations ago. They wait. And when the gates close at sundown, and the last tour guide locks the doors, Greystone Mansion settles into silence once more. The chandeliers go dark, the marble floors grow cold, and somewhere in the east wing, in a guest bedroom that smells faintly of whiskey and cigarette smoke, 2 shadows move through the darkness, still trapped in a moment that has never quite ended. The mystery of what happened that February night in 1929 may never be solved. The witnesses are dead. The evidence has been contaminated, scattered, lost to time. All that remains is the mansion itself, standing guard over its secrets, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the questions that have haunted this place for nearly 100 years. Who really pulled the trigger? What secrets were worth dying for? And what holds the spirits of Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett to this earth, long after their bodies have turned to dust in their neighboring graves at Forest Lawn? The ghosts of Greystone know the answers, but they are not telling. Not yet. Perhaps they are waiting for someone who truly wants to know. Someone willing to walk these halls at midnight, to sit in that guest bedroom as the clock strikes 11, to ask the questions that have echoed through the decades. Perhaps, someday, the truth will finally emerge from the shadows of Los Angeles's most cursed mansion. Until then, Greystone waits, silent, beautiful, haunted, a monument to wealth and tragedy, to love and betrayal, to secrets that outlive the men who kept them. The dark story of the Christmas murder inside Los Angeles's most cursed mansion is not over. It never ends. But to truly understand the weight of what happened within these walls, we must return once more to the men at the heart of this tragedy and the world they inhabited before everything fell apart. Consider the irony of Greystone's creation. Edward Doheny Sr. built this mansion during the very years when his empire was under assault from federal investigators. While stonemasons carved the limestone facades and craftsmen hand-polished the oak banisters, lawyers in Washington were poring over documents that could send Doheny to prison. The father was building a palace for his son, even as the foundation of their fortune crumbled beneath them. The elder Doheny never stopped believing he would prevail. He had survived 2 decades of hardship in the Arizona and New Mexico territories. He had struck oil when everyone thought him finished. He had built an empire that stretched from California to Venezuela. What were a few senators and prosecutors compared to the Apache warriors he had fought, the mountain lions he had wrestled, the mine shafts he had survived? But the Teapot Dome scandal was different from anything Doheny had faced before. This was not a battle of strength or cunning. It was a battle of perception, fought in courtrooms and newspapers, where the truth mattered less than what people believed. And what people believed, increasingly, was that Edward Doheny was a symbol of everything wrong with American capitalism. A robber baron who had bribed his way to billions while ordinary citizens struggled through the booming, reckless economy of the 1920s. The trial of Edward Doheny Sr. began in 1926 and dragged on for years. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who understood how to manipulate juries and exploit legal technicalities. The defense strategy was simple but audacious. The $100,000 was not a bribe. It was a loan, given out of friendship between 2 old prospecting companions from the frontier days. The argument was absurd on its face. Albert Fall had never repaid a penny of the so-called loan. He had used the money to buy a ranch in New Mexico, to stock it with cattle, to live in a style far beyond what his government salary could afford. But the Doheny lawyers hammered their point relentlessly. There was no written record of a bribe, no explicit quid pro quo, just cash between friends. In March of 1930, after years of legal wrangling, a jury acquitted Edward Doheny of bribery. It was a stunning verdict, made even more bizarre by the fact that Albert Fall had already been convicted of accepting the same bribe that Doheny was found not guilty of giving. The legal system, it seemed, had concluded that Fall had taken a bribe from no one, that $100,000 had materialized in his bank account from thin air. The acquittal brought Doheny no joy. His son was dead. His reputation was destroyed. His health was failing. He retreated to his Chester Place mansion, rarely venturing out, receiving few visitors. The oil wells still pumped, the money still accumulated. But the light had gone out of Edward Doheny's eyes. Those who saw him in his final years described a broken man. He would sit for hours staring at photographs of Ned, at the baby pictures and the graduation portraits and the wedding photos. He would weep openly, his massive frame shaking with grief. The frontier toughness that had carried him through so many hardships had finally failed him. He had conquered every obstacle the world threw at him, except the one that mattered most, keeping his son alive. When Doheny died in 1935, the newspapers gave him mixed obituaries. Some praised his pioneering achievements in the oil industry, his transformation of Los Angeles from a dusty backwater to an industrial powerhouse. Others dwelt on the scandals, the bribes, the convenient acquittal that many considered a miscarriage of justice. All mentioned the tragedy at Greystone, the death of the son for whom the great mansion had been built. His widow Estelle became one of the most generous Catholic philanthropists in American history. She donated millions to churches, schools, and hospitals. She endowed the Carrie Estelle Doheny Eye Hospital. She accumulated one of the finest private collections of rare books and manuscripts in the world, including a Gutenberg Bible that would eventually sell for millions of dollars. Some saw her generosity as genuine piety. Others whispered that she was trying to buy absolution for sins that could never be forgiven. The Doheny fortune, once among the largest in America, slowly dissipated over the generations. Taxes claimed their share. Legal fees devoured millions. Poor investments squandered what remained. The Chester Place mansion, where Edward and Estelle had lived, became part of Mount St. Mary's College. The vast ranch lands were sold off piece by piece. The empire that one prospector had built from nothing returned, inevitably, to almost nothing. But Greystone remained. Through the decades, the mansion survived while so much else fell away. It survived the Great Depression, when fortunes larger than the Dohenys were wiped out overnight. It survived World War II, when metal and materials were rationed and grand estates across America fell into disrepair. It survived the post-war building boom that transformed Beverly Hills from a community of mansions into a maze of subdivisions. And it survived the memories. Every few years, a new generation discovers the story of Greystone. A journalist writes an article. A filmmaker produces a documentary. A true crime podcast examines the evidence with fresh eyes. Each time, the same questions are raised. Each time, the same absence of answers frustrates those who seek them. The case files, if they still exist, are sealed. The autopsy reports have never been released in full. The statements of witnesses have been lost to time or deliberately destroyed. All that remains are newspaper clippings from 1929, yellowing and fading, their sensational headlines preserved in library archives. Doheny heir slain by mad secretary, screamed the Los Angeles Times. Murder and suicide in Beverly Hills mansion. Grief-stricken father carried from death scene. The coverage lasted barely a week. Then the newspapers moved on to other scandals, other tragedies, leaving the Doheny family to bury their dead and count their blessings. They had escaped the worst. The son was gone, but the father remained free. The fortune was diminished, but not destroyed. Life, as it always does, continued. For Lucy, continuation meant reinvention. She married Lee Batson, an investment dealer, barely a year after Ned's death. Some called the union indecently hasty. Others suggested she had simply done what society women of her era were expected to do: find a new husband to provide stability and respectability for herself and her 5 children. The Batsons lived at Greystone for more than 2 decades, hosting parties and dinners as if the tragedy in the East Wing had never occurred. The children grew up, married, had children of their own. The grandchildren would visit the mansion, playing on the same terraces where their father and his siblings had once run and laughed. But they knew never to ask about what happened in the guest bedroom. That subject was forbidden, a locked door in the family's collective memory. Lucy's grandchildren would later describe her as a formidable woman, dignified and controlled, never betraying emotion about the past. If she was haunted by memories, she kept those ghosts to herself. Only at the very end of her life, in her final years, did Lucy's behavior begin to seem strange. The morning ritual of dressing for an engagement that never came. The waiting in the wingback chair, purse in lap, as if expecting a visitor who would never arrive. Was she waiting for Ned? For Hugh? For death itself? No one knows. No one ever asked. When she died in 1993, the last direct witness to the events of February 16th, 1929, passed from the earth. Whatever she knew, whatever she suspected, whatever she had seen in that guest bedroom during those terrible hours between the first gunshot and the arrival of the police, died with her. And Greystone continues to wait. It waits for the historian who will finally piece together the full truth from the fragments of evidence that remain. It waits for the psychic or the paranormal investigator who will make contact with the spirits that roam its halls. It waits for the confession that will never come, the document that will never surface, the witness who will never emerge from the shadows. The mansion has become something more than a building. It has become a symbol of the unknowable, a reminder that even in an age of forensic science and digital records, some mysteries resist solution. The rich and powerful can buy silence. The past can be erased. And two young men can die in a guest bedroom, their final words lost forever. Their killers, whether themselves or someone else, escaping justice for eternity. Standing at the gates of Greystone as the sun sets over Beverly Hills, watching the mansion's gray walls turn golden and then fade to shadow, one feels the weight of nearly a century of unanswered questions. The tourists have gone home. The rangers have locked the doors. The city below glitters with 10 million lights, a sprawling metropolis that barely existed when Edward Doheny first struck oil in the tar pits. Everything has changed, and nothing has changed. The mystery remains, the ghosts remain, and the mansion, patient and eternal, watches over them all.